Okay, I don't normally do patch notes, but there were a couple of things in this patch that were really worth taking a look at. So I want to focus in on three specific things from this patch and kind of talk a lot about them because I think they're pretty important. If you're interested in watching like a full patch rundown, I recommend going and watching like LS's patch video, which gets posted on the FlyQuest channel. Or if you want a very, very long form version, maybe watching Freaks patch notes videos. Those are the ones that I usually go and watch myself. That being said, there were a couple of things here that I think are worth really talking about that maybe weren't taken into consideration as much in those ones that I feel like are worth commenting on. So number one, the matchmaking improvements, right, are really big and quite important. And there's something that I think people are missing here, which is going to be quite a big deal, which is essentially with the matchmaking improvements, they're saying that they're going to increase off-roll parity. So both teams should now have a more similar amount of players autofilled or placed into their secondary roles. They reduce how large LP gaps could be between players in a game, and they decrease the red versus blue side imbalance, especially in higher MMRs. So let's talk about these things real quick. I've played for 1 day now on the increased off-roll parity, and there are a couple of problems going on with it already. Number one is that in order to increase off-roll parity, they're actually just autofilling people more often, because if you have, especially at a higher rank, like I'm in GM, if you don't have enough people who are off-rolled, so let's say you have 9 people queuing up on roll, but you've got 1 extra support player. So you've got like 3 support players, but you've got 2 players in every other role. So you have 9 people on roll and 1 person who needs to be filled. Rather than, like finding 1 new player who's not a part of that group of 10, and putting that person into a filled position or something like that, if they're going to fill that support player on the other team, and then having a fill player versus a fill player, and then bumping one of those on-roll players to another game. What we're seeing happening a lot, and this is kind of anecdotal, but from what I've seen so far, I'm getting my secondary role much more often. I'm getting auto-filled much more often. The frequency at which high elo players are dodging, which you can track on the Dodge Tracker website, it shows when every Masters Plus player has dodged. You can see that the frequency of dodges has gone up because people are getting auto-filled more frequently. And so what I'm worried about is that, especially in high MMR, what they're actually just doing is forcing more people into their secondary role. So we've got this 1 person we have to put in their secondary role. Let's force somebody else into their secondary role to create that parity. That doesn't really increase the quality of the games, or match people in a necessarily a better way. It doesn't slow down queue times in order to get higher quality games. It just forces people to be autofilled more often, but in a more fair way, if that makes sense. And I don't know that people actually wanted that trade-off. I think that what we were looking for was maybe slightly higher queue times with less autofills, or eliminating those games where we see people getting put in secondary role or autofill when they have 2 players on the same team who just clearly both main 2 different roles that their teams need. So you'll have a support player mid and a mid player support, and they talk to each other and figure that out and realize that like something weird happened with matchmaking and they could have just been put in the appropriate roles. So I think we're just seeing people filled more often. And so that, that's a trade-off that maybe they needed to make in order to have better autofill parity or better secondary role parity. But was that really worth the trade-off? The other thing that's going on with this is a big change, because I've been talking a lot about champion pool and focusing on 1 role and a few champions and stuff like that in order to get better at the game. But actually, if you can play a second role anywhere near the same level as your main role, like you're pretty much right there, about the same rank as your main role with a secondary role, then that provides a huge advantage for you starting on this patch. Because if you actually play out your games where you're playing your secondary role, you'll be playing against a team that has somebody else on their secondary role. And as long as you're better at your secondary role than they are at their secondary role, you're actually more likely to win, right? So imagine you have a support player who can also play AD carry within, a couple of divisions or one rank within their main. And now you have on the other team a support player who's getting mid secondary who cannot play the role at all. They just have to select a secondary role, but they don't really play a second role at all. Obviously, if you balance the game so that those two players are against each other, the person who's competent at playing their second role in ADC is going to have a huge advantage when they play ADC, because they're going to be matching against somebody on the other team, maybe in their role, maybe in another role, who doesn't know how to play the role at all. And so that's quite a big deal, because if you can play a secondary role well, rather than dodging, it may actually be beneficial for you to continue playing those games out. In fact, you might even wind up with a higher win rate on your secondary role, even though you're slightly worse than your main role, because you're getting easier matches when you're on your secondary role, right? So if you're very close in parity between two roles, playing out those games on your secondary role starting this patch is going to feel really, really good, and I think can be quite an effective climbing strategy. This is a big one. Okay, this is something that is going to be very technical. Probably not very many people are going to do this or willing to do this, but I talked about it a bit on stream, so I might as well share it here. I think it's a pretty big oversight, and I might try to do it myself, but this is why very few people would be willing to do this, is because I'm even a little bit skeptical about how this would work. It's just a theory. I think that the secondary role thing, like we were talking about, is kind of abusable. And the reason for that is, imagine that I queue for mid lane primary and support secondary, even though I don't play mid and I'm a support player. So, kind of sounds counterintuitive, right? If I do that and dodge every single game that I get mid and only play my main role, but it's treating me playing my main role as me only playing my secondary role, and so every game that I'm playing support now, I'm playing against a team that has another player in a secondary role, I'm going to be able to win a much higher percentage of my games because I'm at a massive advantage over the other team. Essentially, I can force the system to only let me play games where somebody on the other team is secondary role. That's a really scary prospect. Now, maybe this doesn't work, because imagine if you queue support secondary and only get support, let's say 5 or 10% of the time, you'd have to dodge so many games that you'd almost never be able to play on the account. If you had to dodge like 10%, for example, you'd have to dodge 9 times for every 1 time that you get to play a game. So obviously the problem with that is that if you're dodging 3 times a day, you're only going to get to play a game once every 3 days on the account, and you're going to be losing so much LP from dodging that even though your MMR is going way, way, way up, obviously it's maybe going to temporarily tank your rank. But there's problems with this still. Even if that was the case, because you don't lose any MMR from dodging, you could do that for a while, build up really high MMR, like to Challenger or something like that, and then stop doing that and start queuing support primary, and then use your very high MMR to just climb to Challenger, even if you're struggling a little bit. Or alternatively, if you're actually getting support secondary like 30 or 40% of the time, then you're probably going to be able to play a decent number of games, and you might even be able to outpace the rate at which you're losing LP from dodging that much by having really good LP gains and really small LP losses, because your MMR is so inflated compared to your rank because you're dodging so much. So similar to how people could abuse the blue side, red side imbalance by dodging when they were on blue side and giving themselves a higher chance at winning, I think people can actually abuse the off-roll parity by queuing for a different role other than their main role that they're not likely to get, and then queuing for their main role secondary, And especially if their main role secondary is not very popular or is priority, they will get put in their secondary role a lot and be able to play all of their games on the account essentially versus a filled player, a secondary role player on the other team, which is a huge advantage. So I don't know how that's going to go, but if people start abusing that, that is kind of a major problem, a literal like climbing strategy loophole that this seems to have created. And so I can only say I hope that people only get their secondary role like 20% of the time or less. Otherwise, people are going to be able to literally just abuse this to climb to Challenger. I'm a little bit hesitant to do it myself, even though I'd love to get Challenger for the first time. And as a very strategically minded player, gimmicks like this are really probably my best chance at getting to Challenger. But you know, as someone who's trying to get to Challenger very quickly, I'm a little bit worried that this strategy would be like a long-term commitment. So I'd love to test it out. If I had another account that was Masters or something like that, I'd like to try it, but I don't right now. So, you know, that's just kind of a thing that I'm putting out there. I think that might have been an oversight. And Riot should probably not let that happen and get off the ground. Okay, so that's, you know, on the matchmaking. There's other little things here like the blue-red side imbalance and the reduced LP gaps, and I'll just briefly mention them. I don't like using LP or face rank to match games. I know a lot of people wanted this to be a thing. They really don't like being in platinum and matching with the silver player, or being in silver and matching with the platinum player. But we've been through this. The reason why that's happening more and more nowadays is because plat and silver have never been closer together in rank in terms of percentile of players than ever before. It's because they shifted the rank distribution, and now plat and silver are not very different from each other. It's not the same as old platinum was. It's actually not very good. And so really MMR is better at matching people than face rank. And I get that like people get a little bit annoyed when they're playing with people who are way higher than them in face rank or way lower than them in face rank, but it's really not that big of a deal. You can have a player who is, you know, Emerald, but winning 90% of their games, and clearly that player should be playing in like high diamond, maybe Masters games, because they're smurfing really hard. And if you don't do that, if you don't put them in those games, what is going to happen? You're going to force them to play against more Emerald players or more low diamond players. And what do you think is going to be the result there? They're just going to smurf on people harder and for more games and actually hurt them. And vice versa. You have people who, you know, a lot of times when you see like a diamond player in like a plat game or something like that nowadays, or a plat player in a silver game, a lot of times it's because they're like a plat 4 player or a diamond 4 player or whatever, who have really low MMR because they've lost a lot, and they've lost a lot at 0 LP, and they're no longer winning 50% of their games in diamond 4. And if they're no longer winning 50% of their games in diamond 4, and they're only winning around 50% of their games in like mid emerald or low emerald or something, it's totally reasonable for them to find themselves in like a mid to low emerald game. Or, you know, depending on how bad they're doing, even in like a high platinum game, or a game that's really like a low emerald game, which includes some high plat players as well, of course. So, you know, same thing at any other gap in ranks. MMR is really good at matching people together, especially over a large sample size of games on the account. So matching people based off of LP or face rank is generally not a good idea. Decrease the red versus blue side imbalance. This was mostly a high elo problem. I pointed this out in my video where I talked about how bad this was actually, but in every rank below Masters, there never was an imbalance. In fact, blue side had a higher win rate for every rank below Masters. So for most people, right, don't even worry about this. This didn't really change anything for you. That's why they said, especially in higher MMRs, because it was really only a problem in higher MMRs that red side was even winning more than blue side in the first place. But I'm definitely glad that they addressed the issue and hopefully have fixed it. Now, the other two changes that I wanted to discuss were, let's do the Senna ones first because they're pretty quick, like Senna Seraphine. I don't think that the nerfs to Senna or Seraphine are that big. And I'll explain why by pulling up their champions here. Or we'll mostly focus on Senna, but just really briefly, I've heard people saying, and again, like full disclaimer, I watch like the LS patch notes and stuff like that, and don't usually do my own patch notes videos, and usually agree with 95% or whatever of what he's saying about champion changes. But there are times, of course, when any player is going to have a disagreement or view things slightly differently, especially when it comes to the fact that like support is my area of expertise and something that I'm focused on. And it's super hard, for me, when I look at mid lane or top lane, there's so many things I don't know about the champions and about the matchups and stuff like that. When I was coaching a team, I had to heavily rely on my mid laner and my top laner to help plan together for those kind of matchups and those roles in a way that I just didn't need to do for jungle and bot lane. And that's just the reality of the situation. Is it's very difficult for a player to keep up with every single role and every single aspect of the game. But so I can totally understand like when he's very quickly going through patch notes and giving really quick takes sometimes, or sometimes just straight up, like misspeaks as I do and things like that. Things happen. But I really don't think that a 20 base heal decrease at max rank on Senna Q is going to cause people to suddenly go an AD build on Senna instead of the Enchanter build that's been performing extremely well. And I don't think that this nerf is going to make Enchanter Senna bad. Obviously, it's a nerf. It's going to have some negative effect. It's directly targeting her healing and her shielding. So that's going to be, certainly have an impact. But 20 healing is not really why Senna is, so amazing as an Enchanter. Her healing is extremely high. It's comparable to Soraka without having the condition of having to hit Soraka Q in order to give yourself the healing for free. Soraka faces a significant negative, minus 10% max HP penalty when she uses her heal without hitting Q, whereas it's free if she hits her Q, or greatly reduced. So Senna was healing essentially at the rate Soraka was healing without having any penalty or without having the skill check of having to hit Q in order to access that healing. And so Senna being able to just do that on cooldown without having to combo or with another ability or rely on hitting another ability or hitting anything is one of the things that's making her really, really strong. So I don't agree with the take that Senna's suddenly going to start going Black Cleaver, Senna and Hurricane. Maybe that's just, I keep calling it Runen and Hurricane. You guys are going to love that. Runen and Hurricane, I've discovered it's called. Maybe that build just happens to be good because of the changes that they made to Black Cleaver, and Runans is a really good item right now. So maybe that build is all right independently, but the Enchanter build is not going to be affected so much by 20 healing at max rank, and it's the same level 1. Of course, you're maxing the ability. It's going down 5, and then 10, and then 20, or then 15, then 20, right? But it's really not going to be that big of a deal. The amount that she's healing was crazy, and 20 per Q is not going to make a big difference. Now, one of the reasons why I say this too is because if we actually look at her patch history here, which is quite helpful to take a look at, we can pull this up here. If we take a look at her patch history, we can see that actually they increased her heal originally to 40 to 120 from 40 to 80. And we can see here that they've reduced it from 40 to 100 from 40 to 120. So essentially we moved from her Q before being 40 to 80 to now 40 to 100. So her Q is still much stronger for healing than it was, just 2 patches ago when they originally gave her this buff. Now the AP ratio was increased to 80% from 40%, and now they're toning it down to 60%. So even the heal AP ratio is 20% higher than it was before they originally changed her. So a lot of times when a champion becomes really strong like this, you should compare to where the champion was at before. And if the champion's still stronger than where it was at before, sure, it's going to be weaker than it was when it was really busted, but it's still going to be totally strong and good. And the AP ratio doesn't really matter that much, because when you're building Helia and Moonstone, they do give a little bit of AP, but not very much. So losing, 20% AP on a champion that's only going to have on 2 items, maybe 100 AP or something like that, is really not that big of a deal. And so sometimes people can be tricked because these ratios sound like a big change to lose 20% AP, but it's actually quite small. And same thing with her ult, right? Her ult was originally... let's see if we can see this here. So her ult's AP ratio on the shield has been reduced, but again, she's not building that much AP, and she's using her ult very infrequently. So like AP ratio on her shield on her ult, really not a big deal, not going to make a difference in very many situations, and not even going to be that much of a reduction in the shield. You're talking very, very few games where if you have 100 AP at like 2 items, 20 shield off of her ult is going to be the difference between somebody living and dying. The shield is so large a lot of times when you're doing that, and the timing's so fickle that that's going to very rarely ever make a difference in any situation. So really, I think Senna is probably going to continue to perform quite well, although of course slightly worse than before. Same thing when we look at like the changes to Seraphine. These are some significant changes for sure. So they're reducing the shield by 20 at max rank, kind of like the heal on Senna Q. AP ratio is staying the same, and the cooldown is staying at 22 instead of going down to 18 at rank 5. So maxing the ability or putting points into the ability is not giving you a lower cooldown on the shield, but it's only 4 seconds, and having the higher cooldown on it is actually going to mean that your ability haste is going to reduce it by more anyways. So you're not even going to feel the full 4-second nerf, because your ability haste will make up for some of the difference now that the cooldown is longer, if that makes sense. So because of this, again, Seraphine is so strong when she gets scaling that I don't really think that 20 shield off of her W or the cooldown even being 4 seconds longer, and again, not quite even 4 seconds longer, because her ability haste will cut into that, because there's going to be a higher base amount to cut into with the ability haste in the first place. Let's say she loses, I don't know the exact math, it doesn't matter that much, but let's say she only loses 3 seconds or something on W. I really don't think that this is making the difference in taking Seraphine from like an S tier support champion down to like, not good anymore. Seraphine and Senna are still very, very strong after these changes. So that's very important to know. And then finally, the Warmogs change. This was a take that I saw Ellis give that I disagreed the most with on his patch notes rundown. So let's talk about this. I think the concept that you're buying Warmogs for roaming movement speed is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. And the reason for that is because you do not complete Warmogs, and usually you're going boots first. You're not completing Warmogs until pretty late into the game. Obviously, if you're building it your first item, right? What is late, right? Like, we're not talking about completing Warmogs, at 40 minutes or at 30 minutes. If you're building it first item, you're going to complete it like in the mid game. But if you're completing it in the mid game, you're no longer completing it at a point where you're really utilizing the movement speed to roam, right? Roaming is something that you're mostly doing in like the early to mid laning phase. I just don't buy this concept that like the 5% extra movement speed that you lost is going to make such a big difference on you roaming at like 25 to 30 minutes into the game, when everyone's just grouping and playing around objectives, um, or you're going for such obvious picks on the side lane that don't really have to do with your movement speed. I just really don't think that the 5% movement speed is why Warmogs was so good, or that 5 or 10% movement speed was why the item was so good. I also don't even think that a 200 gold increase on the cost of the item is as bad as people think that it is. So like LS's take was that Warmogs is just dead as a support item now, because of the previous change that they had made that required you to have a little bit more HP to activate it, and because of this now losing all this movement speed and increasing the total gold cost. And so I want to kind of take a deep dive into this one because I think it's really critical to a lot of tank supports builds, which is, my specialty. And I did an analysis, so let me pull this up here. I did an analysis on Warmogs previously. Let me see if I can find it. So we're looking for like my Braum guide. It's probably in here. So I did an analysis on Warmogs versus Locket previously. And in this analysis, what I found is that if you cost adjust for Warmogs versus Locket, and look at the stats that it gives you, that Warmogs is essentially, it's right in here. Warmogs is making you 13.5% tankier than Locket with a cost adjustment. Now, we would have to adjust these numbers because they've just upped the cost by another 200 gold. But the point is that Warmogs is making you like 13.5% tankier than Locket. Than Locket is as a first item, and that's cost adjusted. If you don't cost adjust it, maybe it's more like 25% or 20% tankier. Essentially, the problem here is that what we're trying to think about is, well, what do we actually get out of 20% tankier or 13.5% tankier? And what I was saying the other day is that if you have 100 armor and let's say 2,000 effective HP, this is about how much HP you would have if you completed boots and then like a Locket as a first item, for example. Essentially, your effective HP is 4,000 against physical damage because you have 2,000 HP, and for every 100 armor you have, it's doubling your effective HP. So you have 2,000 actual HP, 100 armor is going to double that. So you have 4,000 effective HP versus physical damage. The thing that makes Warmogs so broken is that early on into the game, especially against mixed damage teams that have an appropriate balance of AP and AD damage, you should be building mostly just health. And when you look at Knight's Vow or when you look at Locket, for the stats that you want to have, those items are heavily over-indexed on giving you armor and magic resist when you'd rather be buying straight health. The reason why Warmogs is so good is because instead of over-indexing on armor and magic resist early, it just allows you to get a bunch of health for a good cost. The difficulty then becomes when we're looking at an item like an item like Knight's Vow or Locket, those items are, yes, they have some sort of active or passive that are nice compared to Warmogs, that are like better than Warmogs. And yes, they're cheaper than Warmogs, but those actives or passives have to outweigh just how much tankier we become with Warmogs. So the problem is so in that scenario, we had 2,000 HP, 100 armor gives us about, 4,000 effective HP against physical. With Warmogs, we complete the item and we're going to have like 3,000 HP. And we have a little bit less armor. Maybe we'll have like 70 armor or something like that instead. And so our effective HP, we could probably dive into the math here, to be honest with this one. But your effective HP is going to be like, instead of 4,000, it's going to be like 5,000, nearing 6,000. So if your effective HP is going from 4,000 to 5,000, you're getting 1,000 extra effective HP by building Warmogs. That is a massive increase. Because what that means is that in terms of your effective HP, 1,000 out of 4,000 would be a 25% increase in tankiness. So you've got to do some cost adjustments as well, right? Because of course the item costs more in order to get you there. But if it's making you have 1,000 extra effective HP, let's say you do a cost adjustment, and because Warmogs is like, let's see, it's 3,300. So let's say it's, I don't know, 33% more expensive. So we can discount 1/3 of the extra effective HP it's giving. In other words, we just buy that extra HP by buying HP items with the extra gold that we have from Locket, which we'd usually do in the form of, let's say, going like a Knight's Vow or a Locket first. I prefer Knight's Vow first, so let's say we'd go like Knight's Vow first, and we'd complete Knight's Vow, and then we'd build the Ruby Crystal and the Kindle Gem from Locket. That would be what we're doing with our extra gold in order to get the effective HP. Now, what that means is that let's say it's only giving us 666, roughly about 600 extra effective HP to build Warmogs. That means that you would have to average from the active or passive of Locket or Knight's Vow an extra 600 damage blocked or damage redirected or something like that to get the same value as you would get from Warmogs giving you an extra 600 effective HP per life or per back. And that's not even including the movement speed and the healing, the regen that you get from building Warmogs. When you consider those things, you might have to get value more like 700 or 800 from Locket's active every time you're on the map, or from Knight's Vow every time you're on the map, and you just don't get that from those items. So even with the nerf to the movement speed, the item was just so much better even if it didn't give any movement speed at all, because of how much better the effective HP was. And so Warmogs is inherently good because of how much HP it gives you. And I think people just realized finally when Warmogs was given 250 HP for free in 1410, people realized how strong just building HP on tank supports were, how efficient that was compared to building tank support items, which are actually pretty weak. And I've been saying this for a long time. Tank support items are actually really weak compared to Enchantress support items. But because you see sometimes junglers building Locket and Knight's Vow when they shouldn't, there was a perception that, hey, tank support items must be busted, because if tank junglers are willing to build Knight's Vow or Locket, these items must be just like off the charts. But it was never good for the tank junglers to be building them when they could have been building straight HP as well. So it was just a mistake at that point for them to have been building those items. Tank support items are actually relatively weak, and so even just building HP on its own is so much better than building tank support items right now. It'd be really interesting to look into, and maybe I'll make a longer form video doing the math and just looking into this. But even if you nerf Warmogs completely to the point where, like, okay, no support ever considers buying Warmogs, you have to understand that Warmogs gets its strength from just the component items. So you could just build Giant's Belt, Giant's Belt, Giant's Belt, Giant's Belt, and that would be a really, really strong build on support. Now, I'm not saying that that's viable, like 4 Giant's Belts is probably too much HP, but the point essentially is that Warmogs is good whether you complete the item or not, because the value that you get from the item that makes the item better than Locket or the Knight's Vow or any other tank support item is just the HP that you're getting from the components. So you can make it cost 4,000 gold if you want to. It doesn't really matter because the support doesn't actually care about completing the item and getting access to the movement speed and the healing passive. Now, those things are nice bonuses as well, but just the HP, just getting 1,000 HP for 3,300 gold outpaces Locket and Knight's Vow mathematically. It just does. And so that poses a problem, which is they either need to buff Locket or Knight's Vow, or they need to nerf all health items in the game, because all, even if you nerf Warmogs out of contention for support, and this is what I was going to say next, why don't we consider building other high HP tank items? Because it's not really the movement speed or the completion of Warmogs and the healing from it that makes the item broken. It's just the raw effective HP. There are other items like Canik Rookern that give a lot of effective HP. Granted, that one's mostly giving you more effective HP against a lot of magic damage, but there are other tank items that give you a lot of raw HP that you could probably consider building as well if they just got rid of it, and they might actually be stronger than Locket when you start getting into this math. So just keep in mind that the reason why Warmogs is good is because of the effective HP that it gives you is so much stronger inherently than a Locket or a Night's Vow, that unless you're really far ahead or have a really good situation for Locket where you're able to block 600 damage with the item every fight, or you're able to get the equivalent of, like, I don't know, maybe 300 damage redirected and 300 healing from Night's Vow fight, or with Locket you're playing against a champion like a Karthus where you can actually block 400, 500, 600 damage a fight with it. Unless you're in those situations, Warmogs, even after the nerf, is just still giving you more effective HP. And sure, the item completion cost 800 gold instead of 600 now, but it was never about the item completion. It was about the item before the item completion just giving you HP. I'll give you another interesting tidbit about this, because we went into a little bit of detail in another video about what order you should be building component items on tank supports. And in that video, we were talking about Warmogs, and we were talking about, what order you should be building the components in. And I think people mistakenly build the wrong component order a lot on that item, because they just prioritize, let's say, Giant's Belt and then Winged Moonplate, and then they go the, what is it called? Crystalline Bracer. They just build it in that order, but actually what you want is you want the HP. So really you should be going Ruby Crystal, and then if you have enough gold to buy Giant's Belt, you buy Giant's Belt, unless you have so if you can ever buy 2 Ruby Crystals, better to just buy Giant's Belt. If you can buy 3 Ruby Crystals, better to buy 3 Ruby Crystals than to buy Giant's Belt. And here's a really interesting effect, actually, of the previous patches change where they nerfed Warmogs by making it require you to have 1500 HP. So you don't activate the passive right when you get it, unless you buy another Ruby Crystal and have overgrowth in your runes. Well, here's the thing. Ruby Crystal's really strong on tank support. It's just a really good item. We just established that the reason why Warmogs is good is because of component items like Ruby Crystal and Giant's Belt. So what I do a ton on support right now is I'll actually build a 4th Ruby Crystal that is going to go into my Night's Vow or my Locket, not into my Warmogs, but it's that Ruby Crystal that people would buy after they buy Warmogs to activate their Warmogs. I'll buy it early so that I'm actually getting even more effective HP while I'm still building the item. Because if I'm going to complete the item but not gain access to the healing passive anyways, I might as well just build more effective HP, which is, again, super, super strong, and then complete the item and get it. Now, if you can afford the 800 gold to complete the item, better to complete the item, right, than to buy this extra Ruby Crystal. But in my opinion, buying the extra Ruby Crystal instead of completing Winged Moonplate or instead of buying Crystalline Bracer is going to be better for you. So your build ends up looking like Ruby Crystal. If you can buy Giant's Belt instead of 2 Ruby Crystals, that's great. But you're going to wind up with a Giant's Belt and 3 Ruby Crystals, one of which isn't going to go into Warmogs. You get a ton of effective HP for very, very cheap. The problem isn't with Warmogs, it's with the weakness of Locket and Night's Vow compared to just buying Giant's Belts and Ruby Crystals on tank support. So you end up with Giant's Belt and 3 Ruby Crystals, then you upgrade one of the Ruby Crystals to Winged Moonplate, then you upgrade one to Crystalline Bracer. If you're in a poke matchup and you're still in lane, you can actually buy Crystalline Bracer first, which is actually better than Winged Moonplate. If you're in a matchup where you're getting poked a lot, it can be more valuable than the movement speed, especially on a champion like Braum who's not roaming as much, but a champion who's roaming more like a Leona, maybe Winged Moonplating is good. sometimes if you back and you only have 300 gold, and so you're kind of in an awkward spot because all of your items, all these components are costing 400 or 500 for Giant's Belt. If you have 300 gold, just buy the Rejuve bead, because the Rejuve bead, like we talked about, actually will regenerate as much health as Ruby Crystal gives you after a very surprisingly short period of time of health regenning. So if you can either trade in order to be using your health regen more, or you're in a matchup where you're getting poked, just getting the Rejuve bead is totally fine and comparable to Ruby Crystal, and can actually outpace Ruby Crystal depending on how much your health regenning. And especially for tank support champions like Braum, but even for other tank support champions, he has such high base health regen that getting Rejuve bead is extremely valuable on the champion, compared to even Ruby Crystal or other items. So that is definitely something that you can consider picking up as well. So, because of that, I really don't agree with the take about Warmogs. I think that Warmogs giving you about an extra 600 effective HP compared to, per fight or per time that you're alive compared to Locket or Knight's Vow. It's just the effective HP is outpacing the tank support items. And then, of course, if you actually manage to utilize the Warmogs passive sometimes, that's just an even extra bonus on top of that, because Warmogs passive can actually do more for you than a Locket or a Knight's Vow, if you're able to use it a couple of times really effectively in a game. I think that it can still be a bit of a bait. I don't think that the passive is the main reason why you build the item. I don't think that you should overstay without wards or without spending your gold in order to utilize Warmog's passive, which is why I've always said that that passive kind of sucks on support. If they do nerf Warmogs, just consider other tank items that give you a lot of effective HP. Maybe we'll look into some of those, because there's got to be other pretty low cost tank items that give a lot of HP, just like Warmogs, that we could be building instead of Locket and Knight's Vow. So it's really up to Riot at this point, right? They're going to see that Warmogs is continuing to perform, and they're either going to nerf Warmogs further, and then supports are just going to switch to other tank items that give a lot of HP, or they're going to have to buff Knight's Vow and Locket, or they're going to have to nerf all HP items. So we'll see which direction Riot ends up going once they realize that this is the case. One more point about this: if we go to Lolalytics and look at a champion like Braum, it's early into the patch, so I don't want to say that this is definitive evidence or anything like that. But of course, for people who, there's kind of the statistical argument, and then there's the mathematical argument. We can see, for example, that on Braum, Warmog still has basically the highest win rate of any tank support item that's actually being picked. Yes, some of these other items like Frozen Heart and Zeke's have very high win rates, but these are essentially outliers because of the small sample size of games that are being played on them. Which is why it's hard to evaluate the current patch when we're only a day into the current patch. I mean, maybe if we expanded to more ranks, we can do gold plus, it looks like. So maybe this will give us a little bit more data, and that should smooth some of these things out. Yeah, we can see that if we go to gold plus, these items are still performing better than expected. Still a small sample size. I wouldn't worry about it too much. Zeke's and Trailblazer are really bad on Braum. You're just going to have to trust me on that one. The statistics are not everything, especially when you're looking at really small samples like this. But nevertheless, the point is that Warmogs, whether we're looking at Gold Plus here on the current patch, or whether we're looking at Emerald Plus or whatever, Warmogs is continuing to perform despite the nerfs so far. Now, Knight's Vow, is cheaper, and so we could argue that Knight's Vow should have, is better if you're winning the same amount as with completing Warmogs, since Warmogs is a much more expensive item, especially after the cost increase. However, people actually build Knight's Vow. It's kind of counteracted by the effect of the fact that people build Knight's Vow when their AD carry is really fed and they're winning really hard, because you'll get more healing and more value out of the item when somebody on your team is really fed and they're able to do more damage than they take, which happens when they're fed and already ahead. So you're more likely to build the item if your team's already winning. You're also more likely to be concerned about protecting your AD carry's HP compared to your own HP or whoever you're going to put Knight's Vow on if that person is already doing really well and winning you guys the game. Whereas Knight's Vow, we know, is much worse in games where you're not winning. And we also know just from like that on paper, kind of math example, that Knight's Vow is just not going to give you 600 value every fight unless you're winning or really far ahead. And even then it can be, kind of complicated. So clearly just on paper, Warmogs is providing more value. So yeah, that's about where we're at with that. So, keep that in mind. There's other champions we could look at too. We can also see that like as the second item, so let's say that you did pick up like Knight's Vow as a first item, we can see that Warmogs has a higher win rate than Locket or than picking up Knight's Vow second, etc. We can go to other champions that are, more traditionally building the item like Leona, and we can see on a champion like Leona that Warmogs is still performing extremely well. In most rounds here. So we'll have to see how this pans out, but I really don't think that the item comes down to the completion. It's not an item like other items where supports are going to stop building it because they can't afford to complete it. You're just buying the components and that's all you care about. And you'll just, I think we should even look into like with Heartsteel or some like this item or other tank support or other tank items in general. I mean, here we have an item that is now 100 gold cheaper. Is this the previous cost on their website that they're showing? Yeah, it says it should be 3,300. So Heartsteel, for example, is another full HP and health regen item. This item is now 300 gold cheaper. It gives you 100 less HP, but it's essentially giving you the same thing, right? So if the main thing is that you're getting just the effective HP, you can go Heartsteel and essentially get the same thing as Warmogs is giving you. And while it doesn't look like it's performing that well, part of the reason for that can literally just be that nobody's building it. And so it's really hard to tell how the item's actually doing when no one's going it. And generally, right, like if you're keeping up with the game and you're more involved with like what high elo Braum or Leona players are doing, if you're, building Heartsteel, you probably don't know what item you should be building, or you're kind of troll building. Right. But if people knew that that was the accepted item to go, and the people who were keeping up with the game and paying attention to what people are wanting to build were building it, then that item would have a higher win rate because people who are like in tune with what's going on with their champion would be playing it more often. So keep that in mind. So I hope that this helps. We'll see how Warmogs pans out. Good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day.